A veteran bought a cursed cabin for 25 cents, then his dog found a secret no one dared to open. Wind screamed like wire across bone and the cabin answered with a slow, reluctant groan. Nathan Reed, late 40s, retired Marine, shoved the door against shoulder-high drifts while rhyme crackled under his gloves. Shadow, black and silver, German Shepherd, service partner, lifesaver, paced tight circles, nails ticking, breath ghosting in the lantern's thin halo. 25 cents had bought this place at a Flathead County auction. The room had flinched when he bid, as if he'd spoken a name decent folks avoid. He told himself he wanted quiet, the kind that resets a mind trained to wake at the smallest hinge of sound. But the quiet here felt like something holding its breath. Shadows stopped. Shoulders locked. The dog's stare pinned a darker hearthstone near the ash lip. A thin whine stretched tight as wire. Nathan crouched. Cold bit through the callus. Mortar powdered under his thumb and the stone gave a whispering shiver, the way skin twitches before a needle. The lantern dimmed, then steadied as if it had listened. On the table the deed looked both weightless and heavy. Paper can condemn or save, he'd seen both. Habit mapped the room, exits, angles, cover, while Shadow's chest rumbled a measured warning. Nathan traced a seam that shouldn't exist. Damp iron breathed from the crack, old keys, wet cellars, rooms that keep names. Then it came, 3 soft knocks behind the stone, evenly spaced, followed by a fourth, closer, impatient, unmistakably human. The radio hissed dead air. Fresh snow outside showed a single boot print facing the door. What waits behind a hearth that knocks back, and who out there is counting the knocks? Nathan Reed drove north with winter hardening the 2-lane into a chalk line. A veteran who still counted exits and listened to hinges. 2 tours had trained reflexes that never signed discharge papers. Scan angles, trust the dog, leave nothing to luck. He wanted quiet that didn't feel like an ambush. Shadow rode shotgun, black and silver coat rippling when the heater fan shifted. Gold eyes sliding from tree line to mirrors. The shepherd had pulled Nathan out of blasts and alleys and thoughts that claw back at 3 a.m., choosing patience over panic. They understood each other because survival had made them practical. Flathead County's quarterly auction met in a cinder block hall that smelled of coffee and damp wool. Folding chairs scraped, a fluorescent hum pretended to be silence. A clerk read parcels until a name changed the air. Pine Hollow Cabin. Minimum bid 25 cents. People leaned back as if a draft had entered. A woman in denim muttered that some prices mean more than money. A man with a plow company logo studied his boot. Nathan asked for facts, access, taxes, liens. The clerk skimmed a sheet. Road seasonal, power cut, taxes cleared through forfeiture well untested. No recorded contamination, no active dispute. The room's posture said otherwise. He bid a quarter, no one countered. The gavel fell with a sound too small for land. A receipt slid across a table, the deed packet followed. Title passed to a man who believed in preparation and in patterns that rarely announce themselves. Pine Hollow had just offered both. Information lives where people buy screws and bait. Nathan turned off the highway at a general store with a sagging porch and a bell that rang like a spoon on glass. He set lamp oil, coffee, paracord, screws, jerky, a snow shovel and a pry bar on the counter. Shadow sat on his left heel and watched the door. The shopkeeper, a woman in her 60s with a braid and an honest stare, rang items and glanced at the deed envelope when he reached for his wallet. "Chasing a bargain?" she asked. "A deed," he said. "Pine Hollow." Her mouth softened and steadied. "Elias Warren's place. 15 years ago a storm came hard. His dog turned up under the porch, warm and waiting. He didn't. We searched until nobody could feel their toes. No tracks that held. People said curses because they had nothing better." "Apex Mining ever knock?" Nathan asked. She nodded. "Nice pamphlets, travel mugs, cheerful men with clipboards. Questions about old shafts and reports nobody could produce. When nobody sold, they drove off smiling. Later trucks idled on the far road some nights, then rolled away when anyone walked over. Maybe nothing you can." She slid matches onto the pile. "If you go, take care. That place keeps its own hours." He thanked her, loaded supplies, topped off fuel, checked chains and gave Shadow water. Solitude was a need he could name without apology. Crowds squeezed his breath, wide country returned. The dog drained the bowl and lifted his head toward timber as if hearing the road ahead. The turnoff to Pine Hollow was two ruts vanishing under drift. Trees closed in until trunks became a moving fence. Nathan dropped to low gear and let momentum, not speed, do the work. He cleared a fallen limb, eased around a bend, and rolled into a clearing where the cabin waited like a memory that refused to fade. Time had bleached the logs to silver, the porch leaned away from the door, the chimney wore moss thick enough to look soft under eye. Windows held grime like sleep that wouldn't rub away. A shed crouched near the tree line, the wellhead tilted, cap wired. Snow lay clean and high across the steps. He parked facing out, killed the engine, and listened. Wind combed the tops of spruce. Shadow gave a thin whine and stared at the chimney, not the roofline, not the door. The chimney. Nathan shoveled a narrow path and tested each board. The door stuck, then gave on a controlled shoulder. Air rolled from inside with the smell of cold ash, mouse, and damp stone. The interior had been simple long before neglect made it spare. A table tried to stand straight on a shimmied leg. Shelves bowed under jars clouded with dust. A coat hung on a peg, sleeves stiff as if someone had stepped out to bring in wood and never crossed back. The fireplace dominated, a broad box built from heavy stone, mantle scarred by knife cuts and burned circles. Ash mounded in the basin. A black kettle rested on a trivet. Nathan set a lantern on the table, pumped it to life and made a slow circuit that let the room speak. Shadow moved as if a line pulled him. He circled once, halted and aimed his body at the hearth with surgical intent. Ears forward, head low, tail straight. Nathan knelt and let his fingertips learn what his eyes could. Mortar near the floor looked older, sanded by time. Higher joints seemed newer, color just off as though someone had patched the lower course. Then smoked the stone to hide the work. One block near the ash lip was darker than its neighbors, surface dull, temperature colder than the room. He listened the way handlers listen, through skin and patience. Shadow didn't blink. Nathan stood, checked windows and door for pry marks, scanned the floor for seams and mapped exits, cover and distance to the tree line. He brewed coffee on a small stove, the bitter heat, practical as a checklist. Then he fed Shadow, set out water and took stock. Warnings rarely arrive clean. They arrive as patterns, a bid nobody would match, a name the room refused. A clerk who wouldn't say ghost, but wouldn't say safe, a company that smiled when answers ran thin. He wanted work that stacks into order, replace panes, plane a door, clear gutters, split wood, mend fence, even simple tasks, teach hands to quiet a mind. Yet every cue pointed back to the chimney where moss climbed outside and stone brooded within. He set his palm against the darker block, cold bit through the glove into the skin. A metallic tang rode the air from behind it, old keys and wet eye. He withdrew and watched Shadow's chest tighten. The inhale held like a command. He slid the deed into a tin and hid the tin high, not because paper mattered more than shelter, but because order steadied him. He placed the pry bar on the mantel without using it, a promise and a test. Outside, wind braided itself through trees and drew a long note from the eaves. Inside, the heat lifted resin from the kindling. Shadow edged closer to the hearth, gaze unbroken, paws planted as if bracing. Nathan understood that solitude would have to wait. This cabin had a past tied to a missing man named Elias Warren, a present that made rooms lean away, and a hearth that pulled a trained dog like a tie. Whatever secret lived under the stone had already entered the conversation, and Shadow had already chosen the side he would stand on for them both. Shadow's right forepaw lifted and scraped the dark hearthstone, claws ticking with a deliberate rhythm that made grit whisper across cold masonry. Nathan Reed recognized that focus instantly. The black and silver shepherd's body turned into a single arrow, head low, ears forward, tail rigid, breath tight. Wind rammed the cabin, rattling the cap above the chimney, and snow hammered the windows until the world beyond collapsed into a moving sheet of gray. Nathan lowered the lantern to cut glare, loosened the strap on his sidearm, and breathed once to quiet the part of his mind that still measured rooms by angles, exits, cover, and timing. He had learned long ago that the dog's attention meant the difference between unease and imminent trouble. Shadow's stare never left the same darker stone near the ash lip. He crouched and laid 2 fingers along the mortar, fine sand powdered under his skin. The lower course felt older, smoothed by cycles of heat and cooling. The dark block drank warmth from his hand as if the rock itself were thirsty. He tapped lightly. Sound shifted, dense around the frame, hollow at the center. He pressed his ear close and listened past stove hiss, timber creaks, and the wind's long vowl under the eaves. A faint waiting emptiness rested behind the stone. Shadow's breath thinned into a thread, then settled into a soft growl that never rose, never wavered. He stood, checked the door latch and the narrow viewing slit he had scraped in the frost, and found only blown white, no silhouette held near the tray line. He returned to the hearth, slid a pry bar from the mantel and found the seam. Pressure applied a fraction at a time wins arguments without signing its name. Grit grated. Mortar protested. The block shifted a finger's width, then another. When it came free, cool, damp air licked his wrist with the patience of a cellar that had been waiting for years to exhale. He set the stone on folded canvas and angled the lantern so light would fall into the opening without throwing a signal through the window. Beyond the firebox, a vertical shaft dropped into darkness barely wider than his shoulders. Iron rungs, set into the inner wall at precise intervals, were black with soot and slick to the touch. Whoever built this had planned repeated use, not a romantic hideaway. He brushed the lip to check for wire, pins and ground glass. Nothing but. He looped a cord through Shadow's harness and clipped it to a table leg. "Stay," he said, voice low. The shepherd sat, gaze locked on the square of dark, the portrait of discipline tuned to protect. Nathan slipped a headlamp under his cap brim, slung a small pack and swung his legs into the chute. 3 points of contact, 1 move at a time. Rung, heel, breath. Cold thickened as he went down. Soot drew black commas across his knuckle. The smell below carried wet iron, old ash and a mineral bite that pulled memory toward bunkers, culverts and tunnels cleared with engineers who trusted nothing they hadn't touched twice. Boots met packed earth. He lowered into a crouch and let the beam map the room slowly so his eyes could build edges without shock. The chamber matched the cabin's footprint yet felt closer, deliberate. Hand-hewn beams braced the ceiling. Wires stretched between posts to cradle shelves, sagging under jars, tins and bundles wrapped in oilcloth. A rough bench held glass vials, a small scale, folded cloth and a cracked magnifier. Along one wall sat a metal box, suitcase large, edges dented, lid fitted with a keyed lock. Dust lay thick but not perfectly uniform. An arc of clean wood in front of the box suggested knees had pressed there, often enough to draw a faint crescent through the powder. He scanned for tripwires, pressure plates, fishing line and any crude deterrent that time might hide. The knife blade sifted dust to confirm what his eyes reported. Patterns lay undisturbed. He wiped the lid with a rag. Faint, stamped letters surfaced. Warren Field Supply. He tugged the lock. It held. He turned to the shelf. A stack of journals rested under waxed cloth, leather cracked at spines, corners blunted by handling. He lifted the top book. Leather felt dry and stiff, cool to the touch. Pages rasped when he opened to the first entry. Ink had browned to the color of tea. Snow again. Pump, test at the lower spring. Taste metallic. A date rode the margin from nearly 15 winters earlier. At the bottom, a name signed itself without flourish. Elias Warren. The next page held a small photograph clipped with bent wire, creek banks under white, a dark ribbon, where water refused to freeze. On the back a pencil note, runoff below culvert. A rough map in the following entry placed the cabin as a square, the creek as a dark bar, roads as lines and 3 crosses near a fence line marked old shafts. He set the first journal aside and checked the second. Sample numbers, container types, chain of custody notes, dates, air temperatures and weather. Photographs showed jars lined on a bench, sheen on pooled melt and boots beside flagged stakes. One page held a blue smear where a damp thumb had dragged ink. Another listed a meeting at the county office, scheduled, postponed, rescheduled, then marked misfiled. A third contained lab slips from a regional facility in Missoula. Columns of figures marched beside symbols for arsenic, turbidity and sediment load. A scribble in the margin read, "Spikes after trucks on Ridge Road." He returned to the metal box. The keyway held grit. He flicked debris free with his knife tip, then worked a pick while shaping tension with patient fingers. Cold made dexterity clumsy, so he warmed accuracy with breath, letting the rhythm steady his hands. Pins set with small clicks. The shackle popped. He lifted the lid slowly, guarding the hinges from squealing. Inside lay envelopes, a cloth bundle, 3 vials taped into a cardboard sleeve, and a folded letter creased at successive angles as if reread in the dark. The cloth bundle hid a compact Geiger counter with a cracked gauge, a thermometer, and a water test kit with strips and reagents. The vials held cloudy liquid that caught light in suspended flecks. The envelopes contained additional lab slips bearing watermarks and stamps. Some copies wore redactions, black bars dull as asphalt. The folded letter wore corporate letterhead printed in steel blue, crowned with a crack. Phrases lined up like polite teeth: exploration rights, historical surveys, community benefits, partnership. Nowhere did the page say extraction, discharge, or effluent. A signature at the bottom leaned forward in impatient stroke. Above, the cabin murmured under the weather, a low timber conversation that betrayed no other presence. Shadows shifted. A faint thump came down the shaft like a heartbeat. Snow pressed so densely that sound arrived muffled, as if the valley had turned to felt. He slid the papers back into their sleeves, and returned to the open journal. Later entries mapped springs and fence lines with greater precision. Arrows pointed toward culverts. A note advised, if samples vanish, check clerk's brother-in-law. Another recorded a visit from a man who gave only a first name, asked about old shafts, asked who else had seen the data, then smiled too much when the answer was no one. The script kept its patient slant, but the pressure deepened, carving grooves into paper. A shallow shelf along the far wall bent under jars, sealed with wax. He cracked a lid and sniffed. Earth, iron. A bitter tang crept along his tongue simply from breathing near the open mouth. Inside lay fine sediment that glittered when the light struck at an angle. He resealed the jar and set it exactly into the dust ring it had made. He closed the metal box, left it unlocked for speed, and gathered the journals into his pack, wrapping the open volume in oilcloth to protect the fragile pages from soot. He climbed with deliberate pace, counting rungs despite the lamp, because redundancy wins when darkness surprises. Warmth thickened as he rose through the throat of the chimney. Soot smeared his sleeve where stone narrowed. At the opening he braced the block on its edge rather than sliding it fully home, leaving a slender gap so pressure changes would not pop the plug. Shadow waited where commanded, pupils wide, ears fixed forward. The dog sniffed Nathan's coat, then returned his stare to the hearth with the same taut concentration, as if the stone still breathed. Nathan set the books on the table, wiped ash from their covers, and lit the lantern only as bright as needed. The storm intensified, packing gusts until every seam in the walls hummed. Snow ticked across the pane in waves. He brewed coffee that cut through fatigue and read aloud a line at a time, measuring each sentence against the room, the wind and the dog's watch. Dates aligned, places matched. A pattern unfolded with the implacable logic of water finding slope, tests at springs, samples after storms, photographs of sheen on melt, numbers creeping upward when heavy vehicles used the ridge road. Promises written in careful corporate language that never said what laborers would actually do near old shafts. A sound outside interrupted one soft thud, then a slow scrape as something slid across ice near the steps. He killed the lantern, and let darkness drop like a curtain. He moved to the window and cleared a pinhole in the frost with a fingertip. The yard looked empty. Tracks on the path had softened under drift, edges blunted by blown powder. He waited, breathing with the weather, refusing to conjure a shape that wasn't there. The noise didn't return. He relit the lamp, low, and kept reading, voice barely above a whisper. Near the back of the final journal, a pocket held a small card with coordinates, a date and 2 words, Apex visit. The entry that followed avoided names, instead describing 3 men who arrived with smiles, asked about partnership, and left a brochure that promised jobs without mentioning drilling. The last paragraph tightened, until the pen carved indentations through the page. If something happens to me, this record will outlast fear. Have you ever trusted a gut feeling that changed everything? Share your story below. Nathan stacked the journals, set his palm on the leather, and looked at the hearth, where cold still breathed through the narrow gap. The room felt smaller, not because the walls had moved, but because truth narrows choices. Elias Warren had not vanished because winter turned cruel. He had documented rising toxins, photographed sheen on snowmelt, filed slips, and stored samples where flame could not reach. That work sat on Nathan's table now, smelling of dust and old ink. A powerful corporation had reasons to prefer silence, and silence had learned how to move in this valley. Shadow touched the hearth again with that same measured paw, and Nathan understood that the dog had not been warning him away from danger. Shadow had been pointing directly at him. Morning seeped through the storm as a thin wash over clouded glass. Nathan kept the lantern low and read until Elias Warren's tight script felt like breath in the room. Each entry stacked evidence with patient calm, creak jars labeled after ridge traffic, turbidity spikes tied to dates heavy trucks rolled past, appointments scheduled, postponed, then erased. 3 cloudy vials from the metal box rested inside a taped sleeve, tiny flecks suspended like silt in meltwater. Even the way they held light felt unclean. He logged sample codes against hand-drawn grids and underlined the line about a lower spring culvert that filmed over whenever graders worked the road above. Shadow lay still but watched the hearth, ears tracking pressure the way a compass finds north, gaze fixed on the darker stone near the ash lip. The dog's preoccupation framed everything Nathan touched. The cabin was a container, and the hearth was its lock. He unfolded a letterhead in steel blue. Apex Mining Corporation praised partnership, stewardship, community benefit, and opportunity, language that grins while hiding teeth. Nowhere did the paragraphs admit discharge, slurry, tailings, seep, or the blunt fact of waste. Beside it lay a map Elias had redrawn 3 times. The final version showed the cabin, fence lines, a culvert at a lower spring, and crosses near abandoned shafts. Next to the culvert, a note read, "Sheen after truck passes, taste metallic." Pressure in the pen stroke deepened there as if the nib had clenched. Nathan recognized bureaucratic drag dressed as courtesy. He had seen it bury after-action requests behind smiles and stamped forms. He slid lab reports beneath the lantern until the columns stood clean. Arsenic, turbidity, suspended solids. The numbers climbed after grading, dipped with a hard freeze, then rose when the thaw loosened soil. He took butcher paper from a jar and sketched a blunt graph, watching the trend breathe, spike, lull, spike. Drawing it drove the pattern into muscle memory. He dated each surge against Elias's notes about ridge traffic and culvert sheen, then penciled, "Apex crew" beside a cluster that lined up too neatly to ignore. Shadow's tail did not twitch. The dog remained a drawn bow aimed at stone. The box held more than paper. A tray carried bagged soil clods marked by location, depth, and date. He cracked a seal just enough to taste air above a sample. Iron climbed the back of his tongue and sat there like a coin. Another tray contained printed emails, some with headers intact, others copied by hand onto ruled paper when printers failed. The refrain never changed: assurances, outreach, stakeholder engagement, phrases that curve around hard questions until nothing solid remains to hold. He laid everything out in rows the way he would stage a kit before a patrol and watched a chronology grow. Test, complaint, meeting, redirection, silence. The quiet in those pages felt deliberate. Wind gnawed the eaves. Snow slanted past the glass in bands piling against the north wall. The cabin took each blow with stubborn dignity. Shadow shifted once, weight forward, paws planted, gaze locked on the hearth's darker block with a stillness that read as a warning. Under the weather, a motor idled down to nothing. Nathan killed the lantern, pushed the pack beneath the table and cleared a pinhole in the frost. A county SUV nosed into the clearing and stopped facing out, a practiced habit. A man stepped from the vehicle with a contained economy in his shoulders, heavy coat, felt hat, badge under wool. Authority walked to the door like it had never learned to hurry. Nathan opened before the knock to control the first frame. "Morning," the visitor said, voice flat as packed snow. "Amos Holt, Sheriff. Storm's chewing on folks, thought I'd His eyes slipped across the room and held on the fireplace. Shadow stood 1 pace behind Nathan, silent, head low, muscles strung tight. Holt measured the dog and produced a small smile that never reached temperature. "Is he friendly, disciplined?" Nathan said. Cough. Holt stepped inside, wiped his boots without being asked, and let silence do the work questions usually do. "Heard you bought Pine Hollow at the county sale," he said at last. "A bargain like that tends to carry explanation. What brought you out?" "Quiet and space," Nathan said. "I work better away from town." "Understandable," Holt replied, tone dry. His gaze drifted to the mantel where a pry bar waited like a tool between tasks, then to the grit along the hearth lip. He pretended to warm his hands at an unlit fire. "Cold spot," he murmured. "Old cabins keep interesting pockets." "Drafty construction," Nathan said. "Companies came sniffing years back," Holt continued, aim casual, eyes not. "Apex for one, lots of talk about surveys and jobs. People here don't always love clipboards. Some places changed hands, some didn't. You see trucks on the ridge." "Not since I came in." Holt nodded, as if a private ledger had been updated. "If you turn up chemicals, don't get creative," he said lightly. "Folks tuck trouble in corners and forget labels. I don't like writing accident reports in weather like this." He declined coffee, asked to glance at the deed, read nothing, then wandered with questions that looked past answers: supplies, visitors, plans, and whether anyone knew Nathan was here. Shadow watched him with measured breath, posture ready for a cue that did not come. At the threshold, Holt said, "Radio's patchy, stay put and stay warm. I'll swing by when the road opens." He left without a farewell that could be quoted, and the SUV rolled away in a slow, deliberate line. The visit had been nothing on paper, everything in cadence. Nathan reopened a journal and found a folded page. "Met with sheriff. Polite interest. Redirected to the state. No reply." Another entry recorded trucks idling on the far road at night, moving on when anyone approached. Elias did not dramatize, he recorded until accumulation drowned denial. Nathan donned a jacket and stepped out to check the truck, snow flattening light into a uniform gray that erased depth. The driver's side looked fine. At the rear a warning revealed itself, a razor-thin shard seated under the tread, head trimmed flush. A trick designed to fail the tire only after heat and distance did their work. He photographed the placement, levered the sliver out with needle-nose pliers, and dropped it into a marked bag. Tracks near the wheel had already blurred under drift, edges smeared by fresh powder. Inside again, he set the bag beside the journals and took inventory. He photographed lab slips and maps, recorded the graph he had sketched, then duplicated key pages by hand with block printing that would stay legible in the rain. Originals he wrapped in oilcloth and slid into his pack. Duplicates he sealed in a coffee can and screwed beneath a loose floorboard beyond the table's shadow. Redundancy built a margin the weather could not burn, and a thief could not erase. Shadow ate only after Nathan touched his shoulder and gave the relief. Even then, the dog kept part of his attention on the hearth, the way a sentry keeps one ear toward an alley. Wind rose. The walls hummed. The stove snapped as sap boiled in kindling. Nathan rationed lantern time and noted details in a small book kept for this place alone. Time of visit, duration, questions Holt chose, objects he touched, and the sliver designed to fail a tire. Each line concise, dated and useful. Unease settled into clarity. Elias had mapped contamination, taken samples and filed reports. Someone had steered his complaints into halls where forms vanish. Apex had written letters that promised everything except the truth. A sheriff had walked the cabin like a man checking inventory, eyes finding the pry bar, hand testing cold stone. The shape of the problem no longer felt like a rumor, it had weight a person could feel with both hands. Nathan lifted the lid again and found a folder under the trays, photocopies from a regional lab with clean headers and signatures. Beside the official pages lay photographs of creek edges with iridescent film, swirling over meltwater. A boot toe appeared in one frame, with a measuring tape across the flow. On the back a note in Elias's hand read, 2 weeks after grading. He spread the images and let the room absorb what they showed, a slow poisoning written in water. Dusk came early. He walked a short circuit outside to listen beyond the cabin's own noise. Between gusts, he caught the kind of stillness that means every creature with sense has gone to ground. No motors, no boots, only the weather and the slow groan of ice shifting on the roof. He secured the latch, wedged the windows, set the pry bar within reach, checked his sidearm, and clipped a spare lead onto Shadow's harness. He poured a final cup and read the closing pages in the top journal, tracing a steady hand that refused to slip as pressure rose. Elias wrote about a complaint filed with the state, a scheduled follow-up that turned into a postponement, then polite silence. He recorded a dead ewe at a neighbor's fence line, then his own water turned brassy after the thaw. The last entry noted headlights below the ridge at an hour when ranchers sleep, followed by a sentence that felt like a door closing. If anything happens, the record must travel. What would you do if you uncovered a truth others wanted buried? Let us know in the comments. Nathan closed the journal and set it on the stack like a weight on a map. Wind reshaped drifts against the walls, cold breathed through the narrow gap at the hearth, where the plug did not sit flush. The storm would seal them in. Help would not arrive tonight. That suited him. He and the dog had work: keep evidence intact, keep fire and time from eating what remained, hold the room against anyone who preferred ash to paper. Shadow leaned against his thigh, warm and solid, ears tuned to the weather. Nathan tightened the straps on the pack, set the sidearm within reach and whispered a command. The dog settled into a watch that could last until first light or longer. Together they faced the door and the dark beyond it, braced for whatever the storm might carry, determined to protect proof that would not protect itself. Wind mauled the cabin until the logs hummed. Shadow lifted his head, rose in one smooth line, and pointed at the door with his whole body nose high, ears cut forward, muscles set. Nathan felt the old shift, which means a pattern just changed. He lowered the lantern to a coal, slid his pistol free of the holster snap, and stood in the hinge blind where a hard shove would miss him. A soft scrape crossed the porch. Not branch, not ice, not luck. Leather pressed wood, paused, tested again. A thin blade whispered under the latch, and tasted along the strike. Shadow's growl tightened into a thread, more line than sound. Nathan set his boot where leverage would overcommit. Whoever pushed, let the hand outside make its choice, then drove the plank sideways. Knuckles cracked against old pine. The pry bar fell into the snow. Another weight vaulted the rail and hit a drift hard enough to swear. Nathan threw the door wide a hand's width and put a warning shot into the drift to the right that sent powder leaping. "Off my steps," he said, voice even. "Go while you can still feel your hands." Two silhouettes were scattered into white. He shut, bolted, chained, and wedged. The shepherd stayed on the threshold because orders come before impulse. Nathan listened until the wind reclaimed the house, pocketed the casing, and wrote a short line in his notebook. Attempted entry, 2, pry at latch. The storm pressed harder, as if insulted. Headlights swam through snow like coins behind gauze. An SUV idled nose out, tires already set to flee. The rear door opened with a careful, expensive motion. A tall man stepped down wearing a dark winter coat that drank the light. He did not hurry. He studied the cabin with a patient owner's eye. Then the door, then the mossed chimney. Nathan cracked the door an inch and kept the chain tight. "Mr. Reed," the man said, voice smooth. "Victor Crane, Apex Mining." Shadow leaned into Nathan's leg, silent but coiled. Nathan gave no greeting. "I dislike watching a veteran freeze in a ruin," Crane said, almost kind. "You bought Pine Hollow for a quarter. Take a real figure, sign a waiver that removes past and future headaches, and let my office move you somewhere warm before the weather finishes what time started." "Odd hour for help," Nathan said. "Operations dictate hour," Crane replied. "Storms are fatal to old timber and to records kept in houses like this." He smiled without heat. "Sheriff Holt mentioned he checked on you. Sensible man. He worries about sparks. I worry about liability. Inspections need warrants," Nathan said. "Surveys need consent," Crane said. "We hold permits on adjacent tracks, and provisional rights along the ridge. Rumor harms projects. Rumor grows in cabins. Sell the structure and its contents. Keep dignity, profit, and calm. We'll clean up whatever history left." "The last owner kept more than rumor," Nathan said. "Journals are stories," Crane answered. "Stories change when read aloud. Winter buries, spring erases. I prefer solutions that prevent confusion." His eyes flicked to the hearth, then back. "Let my team remove combustible clutter before something accidental finds it." The offer was built to feel reasonable, even merciful. Nathan let it touch the surface of his mind and slide off. He saw Shadow paw a darker stone, cold air breathing through a crack, cloudy vials catching light like silt, numbers that rose after trucks ground the ridge road. He pictured Elias Warren riding through postponements until the nib carved grooves into the page. Crane had arrived with leverage because men like him never arrive without it. "No sale," Nathan said. Crane's smile thinned but held. Numbers move minds. Evidence moves outcomes. Nathan said, those change minds. Crane stepped closer, not enough to count as an advance. Just enough to lower the space between voices. You respect rules, he said. You also understand attrition. This place will eat your year with fillings. Claims, counterclaims, liens, hearings, process serve. You will grow old proving nothing happened while we speak about regional benefit. The dog will listen to envelopes. Maybe, Nathan said, maybe agents will read journals. Crane's gaze moved to the driver, forward lean, light on heels, coat cut to hide carry. Then back. Men like you try to hold a river with hands, he said softly. I offer a bridge. Take it. Leave, Nathan said. Crane nodded as if agreeing to a fact. We'll revisit when the road clears, he said. Storms pass. Interests don't. Fuel gels. Flues free. Holt can't be everywhere when the highway stacks wreck. Nature trims stubborn branches. His eyes dropped to Shadow, who hadn't moved. Ever had a companion who stood by you in a crisis? Share their story below. The line sounded casual and landed like a. They climbed into the SUV and rolled toward the trees. Engine noise dissolved into the weather. Nathan kept the chain tight and did another interior loop, letting hands confirm what eyes could miss. He slid Elias's journals into a sealed tin wrapped in oilcloth and tucked it inside the flue void, then placed a decoy binder under the table padded with blank paper and one photocopy. He strung a line from the door to a bell so any forced entry would buy him a half second. He checked the rifle, wiped the pistol and laid both within reach. He pulled on gloves and stepped into the yard to check his truck. Snow-erased edges made distance lie. No new tampering around the rims. No prints past the churned drift where the porch scuffle had marked the powder. He cleared the cowl, lifted the wipers and went back inside. The stove ticked. The logs sighed. The house settled like an old animal choosing where to brace. Nathan banked the fire to a hard glow that wouldn't paint him on the window. He staged spare gloves, water, a second leash and a pry bar on the mantel. Unease had formed now. Elias's entries mapped contamination with numbers and jars. Holt had appeared with polite eyes that counted shelves. Strangers had tested the latch like they already knew proof lived behind stone. Apex had sent its chief with a velvet hammer. The chain is linked without gaps. The valley was a board. The cabin is a contested square. The heart is the key to the game. Wind pressed until nails. Somewhere beyond the trees, men with radios would be speaking in clean phrases about time, cover and fuel. Inside, one man and one dog split the night into tasks. Hold the door, protect the record, keep heat without beacon, remain patient without relaxing. Nathan gave Shadow a hand sign that meant sleep with one ear. The shepherd closed his eyes and did not slacken a muscle. The storm raged on, but they were set, braced, ready to meet the next attempt with accuracy rather than panic. Crane's parting voice lingered like a wire strung across a dark trail. A heater could fail. A spark could leap. A deputy could knock with a smile and a form. Nathan named each risk and laid a counter beside it. Fuel filters warmed near the stove. Extinguisher staged by the door. Shovel within reach. A second exit was cleared at the back in case the fire cut off the room. The radio scanned. The bell line waited. Evidence sat where flame would not reach it. The dog breathed steadily. Outside, the road disappeared into a moving wall. Inside, purpose held. Nathan settled with his back to the logs and his palm on warm fur. Shadow's ear flicked against his wrist, then stilled. They listened to the gusts hunt for a seam they could pry and found none. When the next knock came, pry bar, badge or fire, they would answer from a place that knew which things in a storm cannot be surrendered and still call the morning a win. Snow pressed in hard. Shadow held post by the hearth like a sentry guarding a bridge, muscles coiled while his eyes tracked seams of darkness between gusts that flattened the glass. Nathan spread Elias Warren's journals across the table and built a valley map on butcher paper, pinning coordinates, tracing creeks, penciling culverts and marking abandoned shafts with crosses. Dates paired with sample codes formed a lattice of cause and effect: ridge grading, thaw, discoloration, then spikes in arsenic and turbidity. He drew a simple graph that rose whenever heavy trucks worked the ridge road, dipped during a hard freeze and climbed again with the melt. Shadow's gaze never left the darker hearthstone. He cataloged the metal box with methodical calm. Bagged soil clods labeled by depth, vials taped into a cardboard sleeve, each clouded with flecks that held light like ground mica. Photographs of meltwater wearing a thin rainbow skin. Lab slips stamped and signed, columns marching without apology. Letters on steel blue letterhead praising stewardship, partnership, opportunity, and resilience while never mentioning discharge, tailings, seep, or liability. He matched each piece to the map until every river, fence line, and culvert answered to a page. Wind shouldered the cabin until the logs hummed like a tuned string. Shadow drifted from window to door and back to the hearth, nose reading air that slipped through nail holes. Nathan dimmed the lantern under a red lens and drew drainage arrows down slopes toward ranch wells and the lower spring. Gravity made accomplices of ditches. Every cut in the road became a chute. He circled 3 access points reachable once graders freed the county, underlined the lower spring twice, and penciled tasting notes. Elias had written in a hand that never panicked, metallic, brassy, bitter after rain. He stared at the hearth and understood the design. Fire destroys records, soot hides seams, cold keeps samples stable, build a cellar behind stone, and truth survives long enough to travel. Elias had learned that meetings produced smiles and postponements while trucks moved on time. He answered circular conversations with redundancy: test, label, photograph, duplicate, cache. Silence did not come because winter turned cruel. It arrived because evidence gathered into a weight that a corporation could not afford. Nathan created 2 packets. The primary held journals, lab slips, photographs, maps, and his summary. The redundant copies, a graph, chain of custody notes, and coordinates. He sealed both in oilcloth, then rehearsed retrieval in darkness using a tether from table to hearth so he could find the cellar lip after a blackout. The storm deepened until the world shrank to a circle of breath. Frost sifted from rafters like talc. Shadow paused at the back wall, ears forward, then resumed his loop with a patience that made the room feel defended. He needed to reach beyond drifts and badging. Lucas Hayes had served alongside him, then turned reporting into a second theater for stubborn facts. Lucas worked out of Boise on pieces that demanded patience, caution, and a clock. Nathan powered a laptop he treated like medicine, scanned pages under the red lens, and built an encrypted archive. The passphrase used a poem line they had recited during a 7-night rotation on a desert outpost, salted with an MRE joke, only they would remember. He recorded a short voice memo that summarized locations, methods, instruments, and preliminary conclusions without a single adjective. He composed a message with ruthless economy, package alpha, environmental contamination tied to Apex operations. Link below. Passphrase, poem opener plus MRE tag. If no confirmation by 0600, notify FBI Environmental Crimes, Missoula Field Office and State Water Quality. The phone hunted for a bar like a gull sweeping a gray harbor. When a flicker appeared, he sent the text, then the link, then the memo. The first failed, the second stalled, the third crawled, then cleared. He resented the first. The cabin felt smaller as minutes stacked. Nathan labeled the primary packet carrier, slid it behind the dark stone, and set the block with a gap that let cold breathe without giving the plug away. The redundant packet he sealed inside a coffee can beneath a floorboard beyond the table's shadow. He wrote a card in block letters: if no reply by 0600, escalate. No contact equals compromise, and taped it above the table where a stranger could not miss it, should the room ever change hands. Wind shoved hard enough to pop a nail by the shelf. Nathan reread late entries and felt anger cool into purpose. Elias had filed complaints, scheduled follow-ups, documented postponements, and recorded trucks idling below the ridge at hours when ranchers sleep. The final lines offered no drama, only forward motion toward a finish someone else selected. He kept reading until the pattern sharpened to a blade. The worst spikes followed maintenance on the ridge road used by Apex crew. A memorandum copied by hand referenced historic adit stabilization, phrasing that disguises excavation. A brochure promised community stewardship while listing numbers that only covered payroll. A lab slip showed arsenic at a level that would force notices if regulators saw. Nathan wrote conversions into units that any investigator could present in a room that tolerates no vagueness. The phone vibrated once, a ghost through the noise. Lucas received memo. Link dead. Try again. Nathan resent the archive through a second channel, then transmitted 3 stills and his graph as independent files. He added coordinates in plain text, then wrote, "Window unstable. If no ping from me by 0600, start the process." Minutes later, confirmation arrived in 2 words, "Files received." A third message followed, "Who else is aware?" He typed, "Sheriff visited. Questions suggested knowledge. A corporate contact is present tonight." Lucas replied, "Copy, 6 a.m. trigger armed. Stay dark." Shadow resumed his measured loop: door, window, stove, back corner, hearth, then lay sphinx still with his nose pointed at the seam that hid the cellar mouth. Nathan rested a hand on warm fur and felt the clock more than the storm. Every tick between now and dawn weighed the same. He staged flares, loaded magazines, checked the extinguisher and cracked the back exit so heat would not swell the frame. He set water, food, first aid, batteries and spare gloves within easy reach, then sat where he could see the door, the map and the dog without moving his head. He opened a page where Elias had listed households near the lower spring, then drawn simple smiles beside clear taste on early tests. Later that column turned to frowns and brief remarks, headaches, rashes, metallic mouthfeel after rain. A man who could have shouted chose evidence and clarity instead, not because snow disoriented him, but because numbers make juries listen when words would be dismissed as bitterness. Apex's letters framed extraction as progress. His tables proved harmful. Nathan closed the book and looked at his watch, 22:40. He wrote the time on the card under the FBI line and underlined 0600. Snow pressed harder, pinning the valley into a tight white room. Sites had names, routes had distances, evidence had redundancy. A friend had possession, a clock had teeth. Whatever came before morning, the record would live long enough to reach hands that could force doors other men had tried to keep closed. Shadow settled, unblinking, while the wind screamed against timber. Snow erased edges until yard, track and timber fused into one seething wall. The blizzard climbed to a pitch that made nails sing and glass quiver. Nathan dimmed the lantern to a coal, checked the tether routed from the table to the hearth cache, and clipped a second lead on Shadow's harness. The shepherd stiffened, nose angled toward seams where cold slipped through. A bell on the trip line gave one pure chime no gust could fake. Weight moved across the porch with the careful cadence of men who believed they owned the night. A thin blade rode the latch, felt along the strike, paused, then pressed. Shadow's growl narrowed into a taut thread that drew a line through the room. Nathan set his back beside the hinge blind, drew and took the slack from the trigger. "Step off," he said, voice even. The chain bowed, the door jumped an inch under a coordinated shove. An arm slid through, fingers groping the catch. Nathan drove the plank sideways and mashed knuckles against old pine. He put a warning round into the jamb above the wrist. Splinters spat, the arm vanished. Feet scrambled across boards. Glass to his left imploded under a wrapped crowbar. Fabric shoved through. Shadow launched, locked teeth on sleeve, then bone, and anchored the intruder inside the frame. A strangled cry tore through the smoke. Nathan fired low into the porch rail where boots clustered, not to wound but to wreck cadence. A body dropped into drift. "Oil," someone hissed. A can sloshed. Liquid striped the door, ran under the mat, and licked toward the kindling stacked near the wall. The smell overruled every other cue. A match rasped. Nathan kicked the burning trail back into the snow, slammed the door, and clipped the matchman's sleeve as he recoiled. Flame flared, died, then crawled where fuel had already darkened grain. Another bottle shattered against the sill, viscous, slick, spattering boards. He flung a wool blanket over the growing tongue and beat hard. Heat walked up fibers and raced along fumes. Smoke multiplied, filling low first, then climbing like it had stairs. The bell near the back rattled fast. They were seating both entries to crown the room, force air to feed the ceiling and turn the shelter into a kiln. Nathan rolled a barrel of packed snow he had shoved earlier, and heaved slush through the gap. Steam screamed when it hit hot oil, blanking vision. A shadow lunged inside that whiteout, blade forward. Nathan cut across the glove, opened the fabric and slammed the man shoulder first into the jam. Bone met wood with a sound that ends arguments. The man sagged outside the swing. Nathan dropped the bar and crawled under the smoke to the hearth. Boards above the mantel popped, then fell, trailing fire like flags. He found the darker stone by touch, levered the plug an inch, slid the primary packet from the void, and jammed it inside his coat against ribs where heat would need to take him to claim it. The redundant copy stayed beneath a floorboard screwed under a tin. He slapped the stove damper, kicked coals into ash, and dragged a soaked rug across the threshold to buy air. A ram hit the back door. Fresh oxygen rushed across the floor. Flame gulped the gift. Nathan sent 2 rounds into the jam at shin height. A grunt and a curse fell back into the weather. He shoved a chest against the panel, flipped the table under the window, and staged the pry bar at the hearth for later. Carbon layered the ceiling. Heat roared. Breathing felt like drinking sand. He clipped the tether to Shadow's harness and to his own belt. With me. They dropped into a crawl that turned the world into scrape. Heat, breath, command. He counted to the rear exit, felt cooler inches rise, and knew that line still lit. He lobbed a flare onto the front path to burn bright as a decoy. Orange bled through seams, giving the men outside a halo, while he chose a route they wouldn't expect. He cracked the rear door with 3 fingers. Snow shoved in clean, absolute. He listened. No boots by the He pushed through, rolled clear and pulled Shadow after him. The flare painted trunks and bodies low near the porch. Someone shouted at the sight of smoke belching from the roof. Fire had a voice now, a freight train inside a box. Nathan and Shadow slid along the cabin's lee, knees and palms numb, breath burning. A figure rounded the corner with another can. Shadow hit mid-thigh and drove him into powder. The can flew, fuel stripped ice. Nathan punched a round into the snow near the man's ear. Empty hands rose fast. "Stay down," he said, already moving. They used the truck bed as a hard cover, then cut to the shed. The roof belched in a burst that hurled sparks high enough for wind to carry embers down slope. Windows failed one after another. Heat pressed like a Headlights brightened through the storm without advancing. The SUV had stayed nose out, ready to go. Victor Crane stepped from its lee, holding a hooded umbrella that didn't belong in Montana weather, coat immaculate, face calm. Men flanked him, silhouettes squared by training, rifles slung at low, ready. Nathan slid behind the well cap, set his barrel on steel, and named distances, 30 to the first pair, 40 to the second, 50 to Crane. Shadow pressed into his thigh, eyes narrowed, chest working, coiled to break left or guard right at a glance. Crane watched the ruin like a banker studying collateral. "Stubbornness costs," he called, voice cutting through gale and roar. "You could have accepted a solution that spared time and danger. Now you stand with heat at your back and paper you cannot keep." "Structures don't testify," Nathan said. "Records do. Records burn," Crane replied. "Witnesses tire. Snow melts. Roads open. I offered a bridge. You chose water." He lifted 2 fingers. Men advanced to the edge of light, then fanned. One carried a launcher built for gas. Another hauled a saw meant for hinges. A third raised a shield. They had brought tools for rooms, not conversation. Nathan waited for overreach. The shield man broke from the porch. Nathan rang the edge with a precise shot to plant doubt, then stitched ice 2 feet ahead of the saw's boots to steal balance. The motor bogged when powder clogged its throat. A smoking canister bounced from a glove, hissed, and died in wet snow. Rhythm broke. At the rear, a pistol spat wildly toward the well. Bullets chewed a drift 2 yards wide. Nathan traced muzzle flash, then sent an answer that splintered the upright. The shooter hugged. The man dropped behind it, buried to his chest in powder. He hadn't tested before charge. Shadow's ears flicked, then steadied. The dog's restraint under fire read like another man's courage. Roof beams surrendered in a slow collapse that sounded like an old animal finally lying down. A cyclone of sparks kicked free and washed the clearing in orange. Heat dried Nathan's face and fogged his sight in the same breath. Crane raised a gloved hand. The line behind him shifted, but didn't rush. He had decided to let weather and flame finish what men had begun. Even so, one more intruder tried the flank, belly low, bottle snug in a fit. Shadow saw the shoulder lift before the throw and launched without command. He hit square, drove the man into a drift, deep enough to swallow them to the waist. The bottle flew, arced, and burst harmlessly against a berm. Nathan covered, then hauled Shadow free by the harness. The shepherd planted, shook once, then reset, lean and ready. Enough, Crane called, not angry, not winded, only certain. Let it burn. He'll come to us. Men eased back a step, rifles still low, faces unreadable behind wet brims. The SUV idled, exhaust arcing away in pale band. No sirens cut the storm. The valley belonged to wind, flame, a handful of armed men, a veteran, and a dog that had chosen its side long ago. Nathan rose into half-profile, letting Crane see a man who would not run, and would not waste a shot. He steadied on the well cap, and felt Shadow's shoulder lean into his shin like a promise. Rooms where Elias had boiled water, and sharpened pencils collapsed into a torch. Years turned to smoke, yet the packet under Nathan's coat still rested against bone, and the redundant copy slept under a bored flame that could not quite reach. Crane stepped forward until his cheeks were painted orange with heat. Last offer, he said. Drop what you pulled and walk. Not yours, Nathan answered. Rifles lifted. Nathan leveled. Shadow crouched to spring. Snow howled. Sparks swarmed. Muzzles held. Face to face across the burning yard, they stood with weapons drawn, the outnumbered. Rotors beat the blizzard into ribbons, low thunder rolling over wind and flame. Nathan steadied his aim on the well cap while Shadow pressed against his shin. Victor Crane stood in the glare with men flanking him, rifles low. Then a helicopter shouldered through the snowfall, searchlight drilling a white tunnel across the yard. Federal agents, a voice boomed. Hands visible, weapons down. On the ground now. Crane did not comply. His gaze measured the timber. Sheriff Amos Holt's SUV rolled from the road with its bar dark and motor idling. The searchlight pinned the cab, swung back and fixed on Crane. Nathan Reed, step left, the voice ordered. Nathan moved 2 paces, barrel low, palms high. Shadow heeled with practiced calm. Victor Crane disarm. Knees on the snow. Crane raised his chin. This is private remediation during a public emergency, he called. My team is securing a hazardous site. We'll coordinate once the road opens. A second helicopter knifed in. Ropes dropped. Agents slid into drifts with rifles tight and lines clean. Red dots found chests. We have probable cause and sealed evidence, the voice said. Any movement toward a weapon will be treated as a threat. One rifleman bolted for the tree. Shadow's weight surged. Nathan checked him with 2 fingers. An agent intercepted and buried the runner in powder. Cable ties snapped. Another man set his launcher down and laced his hands behind his head. A third went to his knees, steam pouring from his sleeves. Crane held himself upright 2 beats too long, then bent and placed a pistol on the crust as if setting down a glass. An agent kicked it away and put him prone with a knee across his shoulder blades. Hands bag. Procedure mark. Holt climbed from his truck with a peacemaker's smile that froze in the light. 2 agents approached from offset angles, took his radio, relieved him of his sidearm, and guided him to the bumper with impersonal efficiency. He tried a joke about the weather. Steel answered his rip. The cabin roared as joists surrendered. Roof panels dropped with explosive sighs. Foam flowered from a hose under a belly hatch. White blankets spread, smothering. Steam thinned smoke into curtains that smelled of sap and oil. An evidence tech in a marked parka faced Nathan. Mr. Reed nodded. Your contact transmitted coordinates and a recovery plan. Primary behind a hearthstone. Redundant under a board in a coffee can. Confirm. Lower course, Nathan said. Darker block near the ash lip. 3 steps from the table's back leg for the set. A team entered the char with pry bars and patience. Mortar cracked. The stubborn stone lifted. Cold breathed from the void. Pure. Untouched. Gloved hands withdrew an oilcloth bundle. Then a blackened contents arrayed on a field table. Journals in Elias Warren's hand. Lab slips with signatures. Photographs of rainbow film on meltwater maps. Graphs. Notes. Copies of letters on steel blue paper that promised stewardship and never said discharge. Crane watched without expression. Council. We'll dissolve those numbers before lunch, he murmured. Communities welcome jobs. An agent bagged his hands and walked him toward a waiting vehicle. Another photographed streaks where oil had been painted onto boards. A third collected glass from the sill. Holt stood cuffed by his bumper, steam rising from his coat. He met Nathan's stare, waited, looked away and seemed smaller. He had walked this room and counted shelves. Now the arithmetic had turned public. A medic checked Nathan and Shadow with brisk competence. Shadow drank, shook once, and resumed a steady scan. Agents, trunks, wind, the black rectangle where a window had been, the arc of the searchlight moving across drift. The field commander took a statement under rotor 3. Nathan spoke in clean lines. Attempted entry, flammable pour, flare decoy, controlled shots, cellar discovery, retrieval steps, duplication method, encrypted transmit to a journalist with a time trigger for federal escalation at 0600, if contact failed, names where they matter, distances, times, weather, and coordinates. The commander signed a page that turned the story into a sworn record. Mr. Reed, the evidence tech said, lifting sealed bundles. This will hold. He handed Nathan a receipt with case numbers and signature. Nathan slid it inside his coat and touched Shadow's neck where singed guard hairs felt crisp. The dog leaned into his leg. A brief press that always meant job acknowledged. What does justice mean to you? Share your thoughts below. Dawn bled into the storm as a pale detainees loaded one by one, doors thudding shut. Crane met Nathan's gaze across a chain of light, eyes flat, mouth a polite line that promised lawyers and delay. It no longer mattered. Numbers had climbed out of stone and into custody. Elias's careful script had found voices that speak under oath. Holt stared at salt stains on a floor mat like a map to a smaller town, where a better choice might have been made. News would outrun plows, notices would be pinned to courthouse boards, injunctions would stall ridge work, subpoenas would pull emails into daylight, monitors would sit by families who had learned to rinse a metallic mouth would drink without a wince. A brochure that once promised partnership would read like camouflage beside photographs of sheen on agents returned from the shell with another sealed bag, metal shards from the latch, residue scraped from wood, glass from a vial that had not burst during the fight. Nothing theatrical, only careful work. Two ranchers watched from the road's mouth, hats rummed, faces. They lifted two fingers in a gesture that weighed more than talk. Nathan lifted his hand, acknowledgement across cold and law. He looked at what remained, a black rectangle, a leaning mantel beam, a kettle collapsed like a fallen moon, smoke thinned. The well-kept steam. Snow hissed as embers died under foam. Shadow nosed a charred board, sneezed and returned to his side, gaze sweeping the ridge like a man finishing the last turn of a patrol. He pictured rebuilding, not hiding evidence but honoring endurance. A hearth faced in new stone over a small vault that held only memory, a discreet plaque. Elias Warren measured danger so neighbors could drink without fear. A door with hinges that whispered, a bell that announced friends. He had come for silence and found a cause that made him quite honest. Investigators would follow the money, the trucks, the permits, and the promises made. Facts outlast spin. The helicopters lifted, rotors beating paths toward towns that would wake into headlines. Trucks with tape and tents would follow. Crews would test where the map had pointed. The ridge, dark against a whitening sky, would sit under orders written by hands that do not tremble. Nathan slid his fingers into Shadow's rough, and felt steady life answer his grip. We'll build, he said. Shadow's ear flicked, then still. Evidence had survived under the fireplace, cold and intact. The conspiracy had broken open. Apex's crimes would be read into the record in rooms where the wind cannot bark. Nathan stood with the dog and watched the valley breathe, and a task shaped by loyalty, grit, and duty set the first stone for whatever came next. Spring sun eased through thinning clouds, and the valley answered with slow drips that stitched a quiet rhythm through charred timbers and blackened nails. Nathan stood among the ruins with Shadow at his boot, the dog's black and silver coat bright beneath new light, ears tracing birdsong that had returned to the creek. Foam had melted back into the earth. Ash lay like soft gray snow around the well cap, and the scorched mantel beam leaned against a sawhorse he had carried from the truck at dawn. He breathed steam that tasted clean again. No oil, no iron, just thaw and pine and the faint sweetness that comes when snow surrenders to water. Shadow nosed a splintered board, sneezed once, then looked up as if to say the job had only changed uniforms, not ended. Nathan set one hand on the beam and felt purpose settle where shock had lived. He had lost rooms but not the work those rooms protected. Numbers had traveled, voices had listened. Accountability had stepped into the light with boots that didn't slip. Neighbors waved from the road when they passed, not to gawk but to acknowledge a line held through bleak hours. He and the dog turned toward the creek and walked the edge where ice broke into plates that chimed against stones. Shadow paced slightly ahead, checking wind, pausing to study every new sound as if filing a report no one else could write. Nathan touched his collar and the shepherd leaned just enough to show he understood the inventory of thanks running through a human mind that rarely spoke it aloud. Rebuilding began with small decisions. He squared a new footing where the hearth would stand, not to hide truth again but to honor vigilance. He would set a cornerstone engraved with a name and a date, so future hands could learn in a glance what duty looks like when a citizen refuses to look away. Every plank he raised would cross that idea. Every hinge would turn without hiding a single secret. Windows would face the ridge and the spring. A bell would hang by the door for friends. The path from the gate would run straight past a modest plaque that said simply, Elias Warren, measured danger so neighbors could drink without fear. Shadow would own a shelf for his lead and vest beside the rack where coats would dry. Inside that future room a map of the valley would line one wall marked with clear streams, tested wells, and windward roads. Not as trophies but as reminders that vigilance becomes culture when plenty of ordinary days are asked to carry it. Work filled the morning. Nathan hauled scrap, stacked salvage, and sorted screws into jars that once held peaches. Shadow ranged in an easy arc, scouting the perimeter and returning to touch his knee before circling again. At noon a county truck rolled by, then slowed. The driver tipped his cap and kept moving, and Nathan felt a weight settle in the earth beneath his boots that felt like community replacing suspicion. Paper had entered courtrooms, agency teams were sampling old injunctions had pinned operations to a calendar shaped by oversight instead of convenience. Crane's men had traded clean coats for crowded cells, and a western sky that used to carry company slogans now carried a different promise. Work would answer to water. He glanced at his watch and thought of Lucas in Boise sending drafts across desks that had once waved off similar claims with polite delay. Lucas had asked only for precision and patience. Both had arrived on time. Nathan's reply had been brief, keep the pressure on facts. I'll keep pressure on wood, stone and ground. A text blinked back, copy, keep building. He smiled and set another post. Memory walked while he worked. He saw a night in a different desert when a younger handler checked a dog's paws by starlight, rubbed balm into cracked pads, and whispered something about partnership that did not need grammar to hold. He saw Shadow hit a sleeve during the siege and release on a single syllable because trust ran both directions. He saw Holt's cuffs, Crane's glance. The moment rotors carved the storm into lanes that carried law. None of it felt cinematic now. It felt plain stories make sturdy foundations when told without varnish. By afternoon the sun warmed open patches of grass beside the char, and meltwater drew narrow mirrors along the road. Shadow found the only intact step and sat, chest high, back straight, gaze on Nathan's hands calm as a sentry waiting for the next assignment. Nathan set down his hammer and knelt to hug that thick neck until the dog huffed and leaned harder. Then he stood and began again. He replaced a fence post by the road and set a mailbox on a fresh stake. In the box he placed a single card for anyone who stopped. Justice begins when ordinary people refuse to quit. He closed the lid not to make a point but to keep the paper dry until curious boots found. Afternoon thinned into a gold strip behind the ridge. A crane hawk spiraled over the meadow as if taking inventory. Somewhere a truck downshifted and kept going. Shadows lengthened. The wind lost its edge and tasted like damp cotton. Shadow lay with his chin on his paws watching the road and the tree line in a metronome rhythm that matched Nathan's hammer strokes. The beat sounded like a partnership. Rebuilding would take weeks. It might take months. It didn't scare him. Work had returned to the shape that used to blur. Grief had shrunk to a layer that could be honored without drowning the day. The dog's shadow fell over his boot while he set a last brace for the evening. He pressed his palm to the new post and felt grain answer, as if wood could recognize intent. He looked at the valley and spoke aloud, because speaking roots conviction where echoes can grow. Loyalty had meant holding a door through fire without letting pride write the plan. Justice had meant letting evidence travel while rage stayed home. Resilience had meant learning a slower strength than combat. the kind that lifts a beam after court dates and headlines fade. That trio would frame every board he raised from now on. Shadow stood, shook, and brought the lid in his mouth like a volunteer offering tool. Nathan took it, clipped it, and walked a slow lap through the puddled yard. They paused by the lower footing, and he pictured the new hearth standing there with flames that warmed stories instead of hiding them. They paused by the plaque and pictured small hands tracing letters while a teacher read the name. They paused by the well cap and listened to clean water move under the stone. Then they faced the clearing and the road that would bring company on good days and hard ones. Spring found their shoulders and stayed. Snow sank into the ground that had learned how to hold weight without swallowing it. The world didn't cheer, it breathed. That was better than applause. That was life returning to work. Nathan scratched behind Shadow's ear and felt a steadiness pass between them that no verdict could improve. Tomorrow will require nails and patience. Tomorrow would provide both if he kept his end of the bargain. Show up, listen to the dog, choose truth even when it cost. Before he put away tools, he faced the camera he had set on a crate, its frame holding ruin, beam, dog and sky. He didn't rehearse. He had learned that readers and listeners ask for honesty more than polish when the story belongs to a place they might drive through some. He spoke to them the same way he spoke to his partner before a long walk. He spoke to them like neighbors. He told them the fight had been hard and worth it, the work ahead harder and worthy, and that he and Shadow would be here when the next test arrived. He invited them to stand watch with their own dogs, their own crews, their own quiet acts at kitchen tables and town halls. Then he gave them the single line that had carried him from fire to foundation, a line that asked for nothing fancy, only presence. He walked the creek's bend one last time before evening and watched sunlight thread itself through clear eddies where ice had broken into shining plate. On the far bank, a pair of mule deer stepped from the brush, ears tall, hooves careful, and Shadow looked to Nathan for permission before lowering his head and remaining still. Nathan thought about boundaries drawn on paper and those carved by water moving down. Paper can lie under signatures. Water keeps telling the same truth no matter who owns a pen. He let that lesson set like mortar. When he turned back toward the site, he could already see the frame rising in his mind, posts sunk deep, rafters pitched for snow, a hearth that warmed supper and never again hit a thing that should stand under daylight. He pictured friends at a long table, maps folded on one end, cups of coffee cooling near a stack of notices, dogs asleep under benches, laughter returning after hard seasons. Shadow bumped his knee and carried a length of twine like an apprentice who wanted to help with whatever came next. Nathan tied a marker to a stake and drove it in where the front step would meet the packed earth. He paused to listen to the meltwater ticking through the culvert. It only needed guardians willing to get wet boots when the weather asked. Road dust would return, arguments would rise and fall in meetings far from this creek, yet he and the dog would stand here steady, ready to lend proof when memories blurred and promises turned vague. That was enough to close the day with thanks. He rubbed Shadow's chest and felt breath settle into a calm that carried both of them forward without fanfare. Now, if Nathan and Shadow's fight for truth moved you, join our storytelling family. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts on loyalty below. Your next story awaits. Click the video on your screen to continue the journey.